the Republic of the Philippines, and I invite him to address the assembly.
Well, good morning, everybody. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. I want to congratulate you for taking your valuable time to share insights together, and in particular to the conference organizers and the distinguished speakers. Today, for us, actually, is a double celebration. It is commemorating UN Day, but the 20th of October also happens to be the UK-Philippines Friendship Day, decreed by the President of the Republic of the Philippines. It's something we mark every single day, and today is that very day. So it is a double happiness for us today. Now, what I find encouraging, and the reason why I was happy to devote some of the Friendship Day to come and talk to you, was that in many senses, you are the people who will shape our world. But in shaping our world, you need to understand your past. Because people say that if you don't learn from the mistakes of history, you will only go on to repeat them. So if I dwell on the past and some of the core instincts of humanity, there's an intention in what I'm actually saying. Because if you go back to us as a species that inhabit this planet, we have many positive attributes. We nurture ourselves, we look after our families, we grow things. But in that quest for using resources, improving ourselves, we have unleashed a core humanity which has also been negative and destructive. So if you go back to the earliest days and you dig deep in archaeology, you'll find weapons. We took stones that were used for agriculture, but we also turned them into ways in which we could attack our neighbors, in which we could go and seek out other places, not to discover necessarily, but to conquer. We then entrusted our protection to the strongest, to tribal leaders, to clan leaders, and who then exerted their influence simply by imposing the right through dynastic rule to govern. Not content with that, certainly in Europe and other places, the tribal leaders then chose to attack each other to show how even greater their prowess was. And the history of Europe, indeed the history of Latin America, Africa, Asia, is littered with these small groups seeking to attack another for the simple quest of resource acquisition and power and consolidation. That is the core nature of humanity, and that required civilization, codes, institutions, and means to protect ourselves. Well, what did we do, and how did we get this right, and how did we get this wrong? Well, if you look at Europe, to this day, conflicts break out between neighbors, some of them deeply destructive, but none more so than the First and Second World War. Because we took our quarrel amongst ourselves and turned it into a global inferno. No one was immune, and the Philippines paid dearly for the consequences of conflict that was not of their own making. In the guise of discovery, in the guise of trade, in the guise of wanting to get to know each other, we, the United Kingdom, and many others, extended that to colonial domination. The justification for that was to protect the maritime highways, to protect the roads, and to protect our stores and warehouses. But underneath that really came the planting of flags and establishment of dominance. I'm not going to stand here and defend the history of British colonial past. I'm not going to pretend that we did good things as well as bad things, but what I'm simply saying is that it was an unjust way of expanding influence and power when really, as nation states, there was a need for a new order. Now, why do I say all of this? In recent past, you've heard your president and many other countries, particularly those who come under some sort of challenge, resort to the defense of do not interfere in our internal affairs. Now, I'll talk in a moment about sovereignty, but is it really viable to talk about internal affairs when 11 million of your citizens live abroad and their livelihoods, sustain livelihoods here? Is it really an internal matter that we've caused global warming together and we can find solutions together? Is it really an internal affair of any one country if we take steps to stop you from selling your goods and services to us? If we stop you from pursuing your own development goals? I don't think so. Is it an internal affair of the Philippines if there's a pandemic and we simply do not come to your aid? Is it an internal affair of this country if at a time of severe need as you had under Typhoon Haiyan, Yolanda, that we should simply turn our back towards you? It is simply not a viable proposition or a sustainable argument, and yet we do respect the issue of national sovereignty. That is the very essence of the creation of the United Nations. After the devastation of the Second World War, we came together under the League of Nations in London in a Methodist church to design the future of the world. And that is where the United Nations took shape. Enshrined in the UN Charter is sovereignty, so that we no longer have a repetition of the caveman beating up his neighbor, of a king attacking another king, of one country growing powerful and attacking another, and reversing colonization once and for all, so that we never go back to that checkered history. Individual nations have rights, but individual nations also sign up to values which are universal. It is when those systems fail that you look to the UN to come to your assistance. People have often argued, why was the UN created in the way that it has? There is a General Assembly where everybody is a member, one way or another. In fact, whether you like it or not, you're a member of the UN. If tomorrow a new nation was created, it chose not to incorporate itself in the UN, somehow or other it would find itself in the family, whether it was volunteered to do so or not, whether it paid its dues or not. Such is the design of the world. But why was it not left just to the UN General Assembly? Partly to do with capacity, partly to do with differences in capability, partly to do with the relative position in economic development, and partly to do with vulnerability. The reason why the United Nations created a Security Council was that you cannot have high-level values and goals if you have no means to hold people to account, and if need be, force compliance. And let me say how that can be truly justified, even if you believe that it can at times be abused, and you might even argue that the use of the veto is sometimes deeply political rather than suiting the circumstances in which it is deployed. I accept all of those. But let's talk about a few theatres where we saw the UN play its role. When Kuwait came under attack from Iraq, this was one sovereign country attacking another for no reason other than economic greed and regional dominance. The Security Council passed resolutions which were then backed by force. But it wasn't just the United States of America and the NATO allies that took action. We were joined by 60+ nations, forming a coalition to send us a clear message. No longer will we have a situation where one nation can attack another sovereign nation with impunity. If you saw what happened in Kosovo, here was another classic case, but this could be arguably the internal affairs of a nation. When you turn your guns on your own people, when human rights are abused, when along religious and ethnic lines there's cleansing, then the UN has to step in, it has stepped in, and it is a record that is commendable. I take my own example and experience at a difficult time when I was regional head for ASEAN and the Pacific, when Cyclone Nargis hit Burma, or Myanmar as it's known here in ASEAN. It was, in scale, not dissimilar to Yolanda, and yet, because of political difficulties, our initial offer of help, which was genuinely meant, was considered and then rejected. The Burmese regime at the time feared that what we were deploying in terms of military assets was not a humanitarian mission, but it was a mission of conquest. Perhaps with their history of association with the UK and Japan, their nervousness was understandable. But the offer that we made was genuine, it was humanitarian, and it was based on our desire to be helpful. At that time, we were faced with a real dilemma. Sitting in London, talking to our counterparts in Paris and New York, we wondered what would we do? Our colleagues in France and others said, well, this was perhaps the one occasion where we invoked the responsibility to protect provision in the UN, which is that whether a country accepts assistance or not, because of an overwhelming requirement to protect, we should enforce assistance. We looked at it, considered it seriously, but we felt that there must be another way. And that's when we looked to two organizations to facilitate assistance. One was the UN, and the second was ASEAN. And we contacted Singapore, who was in the chair of ASEAN at the time, and said, could you please convene and create an umbrella through which assistance could be brought to a fellow neighbor. And this was the first time ASEAN actually did more than just talk about helping each other. It actively facilitated and delivered it, using Thailand as the base for assistance. And if the Burmese would not accept direct aid from countries like the United Kingdom, they were willing to accept it under the UN. So therefore, under the umbrella of UN ASEAN, we were able to deliver the assistance that the Burmese people needed. So that is an example of doing something in a period of real difficulty, coming very, very close to invoking something that the UN actually has the authority to do, but finding an alternative way which preserved the dignity and sovereignty of the country, but delivered the aid that was necessary. Contrast that again with the story of Typhoon Haiyan, Yolanda, which happened within weeks of my arrival here in the Philippines. To the credit of the Philippines, and in recognizing the reverse of its contribution, its rich contribution to the UN, this was an occasion where the government of the Philippines very, very quickly, without any need to really ask, issued a formal letter seeking international assistance. That basically meant that the UN could mobilize what it geared up to for a level 3 response. The UK and many others could make its own contribution, and then we could then work together to deliver what was a truly remarkable international and domestic initiative to come to the aid of the Philippines. I think as a model of international response, I can't think of any that was better. And we did so in partnership with the Philippine government, and we did so not just with the immediate requirements of assistance, we actually went beyond that and are still working on preventative measures, mitigation, better preparedness. So as we now sit and look at the impact of this current typhoon going through northern Luzon, I sincerely hope that some of the measures that we've been able to work on together will reduce the loss of life, will mean that assistance will get to the people quicker, and that we will be able to actually learn again from this exercise. The essence of the UN can be seen in many other areas too. I can also recall another experience here in the Philippines when the MERS-CoV outbreak became quite dangerous. And we've had bird flu before that, and we now have Zika viruses and others going through. And this is where, again, the UN plays a huge role. It firstly has the architecture through which information and assessments can be made. It also has mechanisms to ensure that those who are most vulnerable are not forgotten. It also ensures that when help is needed, as it was in West Africa for Ebola, we can mobilize support and take help from us and deliver it in other theatre. In those instances, I would urge the Philippine government to continue to have the courage to step up and help. It was sad that under Ebola, the former administration found it unable to mobilize and assist because it felt that it was going to render the Philippines vulnerable to the disease itself. To the credit of the medical fraternity here, many people volunteered anyway. In terms of peacekeeping operations, the Philippines has been with us in difficult times as well as in easier times. And if an accusation is made about the role of the UN in terms of whether we've been able to solve problems or not, like any other situation, no organization can claim 100% success. And if you look at the Middle East peace process, people will say, well, here's a great example of failure. I don't see it that way. This is an area of conflict that has been going on for centuries. You can go back to biblical times to today. This is not a peace process that unraveled in our lifetime. This is something that has deep-rooted difficulties and differences. The fact that we are still in a process of negotiating a settlement, the fact that people who feel disenfranchised still have a say through the UN, the fact that peacekeeping missions are able at least to monitor fragile borders, they're able to enforce the will of the Security Council when required. The fact that there is still hope that one day we will find a lasting solution means that the UN is actually playing an effective role. It is not about finding lasting solutions, it is also persevering unrelentingly to these great challenges that we face. But let's go to a more positive framework. Because the UN also gives you the right to plan your future. The Millennium Development Goals, the Climate Accord, many of the things that we have agreed upon are really about the very survivability of our species on this planet. And there's this tension, which I referred to right at the beginning, between mankind wanting to secure resources for survival and ensuring sustainability. And let's take climate change. The round of talks went from one country to another, and when we gathered in Copenhagen, the outcome was so dire, many felt that this was the end, that we would not go ahead. And it was again the will of countries coming together that we are where we are. And the Philippines played a huge role in helping us to get to that point. Initially, in a very dramatic fashion, it highlighted the impact of global warming on this country, and in the UN framework, urged countries to step forward and make a contribution. Then when we met in Paris, the Philippines did something quite astounding. Whilst we were content with a 2 degrees Celsius warming on our planet, the Philippines argued for 1.5 degrees Celsius. We agreed. But prior to that, the Philippines had mysteriously joined a group which included countries who had a very different profile, clamoring for a very old argument that it was all the fault of the West and the Philippines should not have to dip into its pocket to assist. The framework that we've now come up with basically recognizes the common and differentiated approach, which means that countries with different capabilities will do their part, but no country is exempt for doing something. So when we signed up, our expectation was that the Philippines would be one of the early signatories as chair of the Vulnerable 20 group to the Paris Accord. Time is running out. One way or another, the accord will come into effect anyway. I would urge the government of the Philippines to do so as a pioneer, as a champion, not as a reluctant backmarker. And there's a huge body of opinion that agrees that that's how it should be. If you're talking about the wider environment, your maritime environment, then the recent UNCLOS rulings is a positive one for the Philippines. It's not just about territorial entitlements, it's also about preservation of the ecosystem around the archipelago. If you look at the way in which we, the UK, have initiated the protection of wildlife around the world, again using international fora, it's another way of ensuring sustainability. I want to end on something topical, and we touched upon this as we went about our discourse this morning. In some ways, the history of conflict around the world is a history that has been attributed to the conduct of men. Very few people talk about great warriors who were female. Very few historical references talk about a woman declaring war on another country and responding. If anything, great women have played their role as peacemakers, as victims of aggression, and then in modern times, peace work has centered as much on women.